The security guard suddenly received a notification to immediately seal off the laboratory, but he hadn't hung up the phone yet. The researcher stood outside, with yellow fluid streaming from her eyes and nose. The guard quickly realized something was wrong and sealed off the research room, but the door got stuck. Remembering his family in the base, so he ran away from there to wake his wife and children, who were sleeping soundly, driving them away from the research institute. Who would have thought that the security family had just arrived in Texas when the car lost control and crashed into the gas station? The gas station attendant, namely Stu, rushed over and discovered that the guard's face was covered in yellow fluid. The guard only managed to say one thing: seal off the city, before he died, while his wife and children had already perished. A few days later, an outbreak occurred in the town of Arnett, with many people dying immediately after infection. The cleanup team instantly took action, but they still couldn't keep up with the death rate of the people. The military quickly sealed off all of Texas, and the gas station attendant, Stu, was quarantined in a local military research facility. A doctor approached Stu and informed him that the security personnel had run away, bringing a highly contagious disease from California to Texas. During this time, everyone who had come into contact with the guard had died, and Stu was the only survivor. The doctor speculated that Stu might have antibodies in his body. At that point, over 80% of the population in both states had been infected. The doctor hoped that Stu could cooperate with the military to conduct research and potentially control the outbreak. With a serious expression, Stu agreed to work with the military. However, the next morning, the doctor returned to tell Stu that the son of a nurse in the base had contracted the disease, and the facility could fall at any moment, necessitating his transfer to a safer location. Stu also got in the vehicle with them, and then learned that they would be heading to the headquarters in Atlanta. The journey went smoothly, and they quickly arrived. The doctor told Stu that this base was several hundred meters underground, stocked with supplies for hundreds of years, and was the safest place in the world. Stu sighed with relief, as he had taken back roads yesterday and didn't know what the outside world was like. That night, Stu dreamed a strange dream. He found himself in a cornfield, and as he tried to escape, he encountered a wolf with red eyes. Shortly after, Stu was awakened by the doctor, who looked very weak, coughing, and desperate. The doctor said he himself had been infected, and that nearly everyone in the base had contracted the disease, interrupting the vaccine research plan. Stu became even more anxious being on the 26th floor underground. He wondered how he would get back to the surface. The doctor said that only the Supreme Commander had the authority. While the two were talking, an infected agent burst in, having received orders to kill Stu. The doctor quickly intervened, using his body to shield Stu from the bullets. Stu seized the opportunity to grab a knife and cut the agent's throat. The voice of the Supreme Commander echoed in the room. Stu followed the lights and soon arrived at the command room, where he met the Supreme Commander. The surveillance screen showed that the entire city had fallen. The commander appeared somewhat desperate, stating that he had not ordered the agent to kill Stu. It was clear that someone didn't want Stu to survive with the antibodies against the disease. Ironically, the base, which could withstand a 5,000-ton attack, could not resist this type of disease. The commander granted Stu permission to leave, hoping he could assist the research center to help humanity continue to exist. After watching Stu leave, the commander decisively shot himself, ending his life. As Stu passed through the corridor filled with corpses, he finally saw the sunlight. However, he was not the only survivor in the world. The center of New York City had become desolate. Larry and his girlfriend Rita were walking on the deserted streets when suddenly, a man in a suit approached them. The man carried a suitcase full of money and offered Larry the chance to take the money, as long as he could borrow his girlfriend for 15 minutes. Larry naturally refused, but the man had two accomplices with him. Sensing danger, Larry and Rita ran away, but the houses around them had been sealed off, leaving them with no place to hide. The two quickly escaped into a drainage pipe, didn't expect the stench was overwhelming, and they could not even tell which direction to go. After walking a few steps, they encountered a rat's nest. Rita could not stand it any longer. She would rather let those scoundrels catch her than stay down there. Larry desperately tried to hold her back, but his girlfriend would not listen. Rita climbed out of the drainage pipe, leaving Larry behind was at a loss for what to do. He understood how treacherous people could be, so he took his phone and continued moving forward. The water level was rising, and as he hesitated about whether to turn back, a corpse appeared in front of him. Larry was extremely stunned. The person was his mother. Looking back a few days earlier, Larry had been a somewhat famous singer performing at a bar. Suddenly, he received a call from his mother, who had fallen ill and had been taken to the hospital. He had not expected there to be so many patients in the hospital, nor did he even know that his mother had contracted the disease. He could only watch as she groaned, waiting to die. Larry had taken his mother home to care for her, but he did not realize how quickly the disease spread. His mother had mysteriously disappeared shortly after. In his dream, Larry received the applause of the audience amidst the ruins. Suddenly, a man appeared, who then transformed into an old woman. When Larry woke up, the usual noise had disappeared. At that moment, a patient approached him and said that the apocalypse was not so bad, that one could do whatever they wanted. Larry ignored him and continued on his journey until he met another survivor. The girl introduced herself as Rita, saying that it had been a long time since she had seen another living person. They were of similar ages and quickly developed a bond. Since the city was no longer suitable for living, they decided to search for a refuge together. However, they didn't expect that they still hadn't left the city. Larry spotted his mother's body floating in the water. Seeing the tragic appearance of his mother, he turned and ran away. As he climbed out of the drain, he coincidentally encountered Rita again. After going around in circles, circles. The two people met each other again, and just crossing the bridge in front of them would allow them to escape the city. Meanwhile, in the town of Arnett, Texas, a young man named Harold stood in front of a mirror, admiring himself. Before the outbreak, Harold had often been bullied by his friends. When he woke up, he found that many people in the town had died. Instead of feeling fear, Harold felt excitement. As he walked down the street, he stumbled upon a gun. The deep-seated nature within Harold awakened, leading him to his crush's house, where he was delighted to find her still alive. With only the two of them left in the town, he thought to himself that there might be an opportunity. Franny, upon hearing this, became extremely angry and wanted to kill Harold. Her father had just died from the infection. Franny gathered all her strength to drag her father's body to the backyard to bury him, and at that moment, she was still heartbroken. That night, Franny dreamed she was in a cornfield when suddenly a white-haired old woman appeared and said that they had met at the Atlanta orphanage. Meanwhile, Harold was writing something on a map, deciding to take Franny out of the town. The next morning, Harold dressed smartly and went to Franny's house. Upon entering, he discovered that no one was home. Hearing water running from the second floor, Harold kicked open the door and found Franny lying in the bathtub. Fortunately, Harold arrived in time to save her. He advised Franny not to lose hope, explaining that he had made a plan to go to the virus center in Atlanta, where there were top scientists who might research the antibodies in their bodies and create a vaccine. Franny remembered the old woman from her dream, also telling her to go to Atlanta, so she agreed to go with Harold. The two left a note on the wall instructing any survivors to head to the disease center, and then they set off on a motorcycle. They were unaware that a patient named Lloyd was being held in a nearby prison after the outbreak of the disease. The entire prison had only him left alive. After 2 consecutive days without food and water, Lloyd intended to eat a rat, but he was locked in a cell, making it difficult to catch the rat. Eventually, he looked towards the corpse of his fellow inmate. He had no idea how much time had passed when a man suddenly woke him up. Noticing the chewed leg of the deceased inmate, the man asked what Lloyd had done. Lloyd confessed that he deserved to be punished. About a month earlier, he and his accomplices had robbed a bank, but during the heist, one of his partners accidentally shot and killed someone. His accomplices forced Lloyd to kill the extermination officer. At the moment he hesitated to pull the trigger, a police officer had appeared. Lloyd was caught up in a fierce gunfight. This time, no one would believe him. Lloyd and his accomplices were locked up in jail, but just a few days later, an outbreak occurred in the prison. Now he was the only one left. Lloyd thought he was doomed when, unexpectedly, the man appeared and brought him hope, especially after the man pulled out a set of keys. Lloyd immediately vowed that he would do anything. When Lloyd exited the prison, the key transformed into a red stone. The terrifying disease spread throughout the world, with 99% of the population unable to escape it. The few survivors seemed to be called together, all heading toward Atlanta. Franny and Harold rode their motorcycle to the border, and while they were refueling, they coincidentally encountered Stu. Stu had followed the message they left behind and made his way there. Harold, being selfish, feared that Stu might develop feelings for Franny, so he refused to let Stu join them. Franny was extremely confused. She expressed her desire to reach the virus center in Atlanta, but Stu informed her that it had already fallen. The two sides said goodbye. Stu continued on his journey and met another survivor named Glenn. After the outbreak, Glenn had been hiding in the woods, rarely encountering other living people. He offered Stu some good food, stating that he planned to continue living this way until he died. Until Stu happened to see a painting Glenn had made of the white-haired old woman he had encountered in his dream. Glenn was astonished. He had painted it based on his own dream, wondering how two people could dream of the same person. When Stu mentioned that the old woman had told him to go to the church in Atlanta, Glenn's mouth dropped open because the old woman had said the same thing to him. As Stu continued to look at the paintings, he saw Franny pregnant. Just the day before, he had met Franny, and she was not pregnant then. Glenn found it hard to believe. This was also a scene from a dream he had experienced. The two decided to set off together to take Franny to find the old woman at the church. Meanwhile, Franny and Harold were blocked by a vehicle on the road, and they planned to leave a symbol on the car. Unexpectedly, a man with a gun appeared, and he made Harold and Franny handcuff themselves. He then opened the vehicle's compartment, revealing 2 girls locked inside. The bad guy took Franny. He hadn't seen a strong man in a long time, then offered Harold a chance. If he could defeat that bad guy, he would release them. However, Harold was inherently weak. Even standing in front of his crush, he had no willpower and could only curl up and hold his head. Just as Franny was about to be harmed, a car suddenly approached. The villain raised his gun to shoot, and the girl behind rushed in to stop him, but was quickly shot dead. At that moment, another girl hit him on the head with a metal rod. Harold lay on the ground, covered in blood. When 2 people got out of the car were Stu and Glenn, who were looking for Franny. They shared the dreams they had experienced, all involving the white-haired old woman. Although it seemed a bit unbelievable, everyone decided to go to the church to meet her. By evening, Franny went to Stu and revealed that she was indeed pregnant. Before the outbreak, she had been engaged, but her fiancé had died from the infection. Upon hearing this, Stu realized why Franny appeared pregnant in Glenn's painting. He was eager to meet the old woman. Meanwhile, Larry and Rita were heading toward Atlanta. Just after leaving the city, they encountered heavy rain and had to take shelter under a bridge. After enduring a series of difficulties, Rita said that even as survivors in the apocalypse, it was hard to find joy like before. She then refused to continue with Larry, wanting to end her meaningless life. Larry did not try to persuade her, shouldering his backpack to continue his journey. On the road, he encountered a boy running towards him with a knife. A woman behind him hurriedly approached to explain that the child had severe autism and that she had happened upon him a few days earlier. Larry noticed noticed that the woman resembled Rita, so he invited her to join him. Along the way, he saw many messages and decided to head to Atlanta to see what would happen. Thus, the three of them set out. Upon seeing the supermarket, they stopped to grab supplies. Along the way, they encountered quite a few survivors, but Larry found it strange that Nadine kept looking at the stone pendant around her neck. It seemed that she was related to the mysterious man. After taking a break to regain their strength, Larry led a group of survivors to continue their journey. Finally, before night fell, they arrived at the church where the white-haired old woman had instructed them to go. They were welcomed not by strangers, but by Stu and the others. Stu was not surprised by Larry's name, as everyone there had dreamed of being guided by the old woman. Stu explained that before they arrived, the old woman had drawn up a list of 5 people, hoping that these 5 would manage the refugee camp. Not long after, the car of 2 individuals stopped in front of a residential area filled with many survivors, all of whom were cheerful and comfortable. The people there referred to the white-haired old woman as the Holy Mother, believing that she could lead everyone through this hardship. Stu and Larry went to see the Holy Mother place. After a few words, Stu turned to leave. Upon entering, Larry saw a one-eyed man, Nick, who was born deaf and mute, yet represented the Holy Mother. No one knew what the two had discussed. After stepping outside, Larry and Nadine entered a spacious house, which would be their new home. Nadine curiously asked what the old woman had told Larry, and he replied that it was a secret. Larry then went to find Harold to thank him. Without Harold's message, Larry might never have found his way there. When Larry mentioned wanting to see Franny, Harold informed him that she was not there. At that moment, Franny was walking around the residential area with Nadine, admiring the clean roads. Nadine thought this place was a paradise after the outbreak. The next morning, Larry and Stu went into the woods to hunt, as it was the only source of food in the neighborhood. Suddenly, a car stopped in front of them, and a man named Joe fell out. Stu noticed that Joe's wounds looked as if he had been nailed to a cross. Joe suddenly regained consciousness and said he had come to deliver a message. Stu thought Joe was delirious and hurriedly took him and Larry to the infirmary. Meanwhile, Nick approached to take notes on what Joe had said. Stu realized that perhaps the Holy Mother had known in advance that Joe would arrive. Joe's injuries were severe, resembling those of someone who had been tortured, which reminded Nick of his own tragic past. When he used to work at a bar, he was often beaten by customers. One man, wearing a ring, had beaten him badly enough to land him in the hospital. During his delirious state, Nick often dreamed of a man who tempted him to join his side, promising to help Nick heal. However, Nick had firmly refused because he sensed the man's evil nature. Angered, the man swore that Nick would experience pain. When Nick woke up in the hospital, he had lost sight in his right eye, and there were no survivors left in the hospital because the disease had begun to ravage the area. He heard screams, which belonged to the man who had beaten him. Surprisingly, instead of feeling anger, Nick helped the man clean the fluids on his body. As Nick drifted into sleep, he no longer encountered that man. Instead, he dreamt of the kind and gentle Holy Mother, who urged him to try speaking. In his dream, he felt like a normal person. The Holy Mother stated that he was the chosen one and needed a representative to help convey her directives, which would guide everyone through their difficulties. Returning to the present, the 5 people summoned by the Holy Mother were present. Besides Nick, the others were Stu, Larry, Franny, and Glenn. They were confused about why the Holy Mother had chosen them. At that moment, she arrived to see the injured man. When the two touched hands, Joe woke up. After seeing the Holy Mother, Joe said he came from a terrible place, where a man named Randall ruled. Randall had promised to lead people to a better life, but the result was committing many crimes. Realizing something was amiss, Joe tried to run away, but was quickly caught by Randall, who nailed him to a cross. Just a few days before, Randall had released Joe to deliver a message. Immediately after, Joe's wounds began to bleed. Crows pecked at the glass window, and in an instant, Joe seemed to become a different person, mumbling that they would all die there. When the sound faded, Joe also breathed his last. It turned out that the Holy Mother and Randall represented 2 opposing factions. One embodied hope, while the other represented destruction. They both relied on dreams to find allies. This disaster was very likely caused by Randall, who had blocked the exit from the laboratory, allowing the disease to spread rapidly. Of course, his schemes did not end there. When Nadine and Larry arrived at the residential area, Nadine looked at herself in the mirror, feeling dazed. Memories from the past surfaced in her mind. On that fateful night, Nadine and her friends had played a Ouija board, and the pencil had moved on its own. They were terrified and ran away, but Nadine had stayed behind to trace the letters on the ground. Nadine was to become his queen, and suddenly a necklace appeared around her neck. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, Nadine seemed pleased with herself. She then picked up a pencil and called upon spirits. Immediately, she found herself in a dark place where Randall had been waiting for a long time. He issued a command to her to kill the Holy Mother and the 5 managers. Nadine replied that she couldn't do it, but Randall assured her to not worry, as there would be someone to help her. This was a refuge during the apocalypse, yet there were those who did not want everyone to live peacefully. He intended to, through dreams, to manipulate others into assassinating the managers. Following Randall's instructions, Nadine sought out Harold, as he had the worst nature among all the refugees. Previously, she had finally had the chance to be with her crush. Harold, as a result, was too weak, had witnessed Franny fall into Stu's arms. The 2 people quickly were together, and although Harold pretended to be indifferent, he was seething with anger inside. This was not the most hateful part. Stu and Franny had just arrived and were already chosen by the Holy Mother to be managers, while Harold could only handle the task of dealing with corpses due to his past experience in the town as a member of the body disposal team. Fortunately, Harold ran into an old colleague, Teddy, and their relationship relationship was quite good. After arriving at their new residence, they could work together again. Harold initially didn't want to do anything but still wanted to have food. That changed when Nadine, dressed attractively, came to see him. How could Harold resist? He quickly fell into Nadine's trap. Upon hearing that he needed to kill a manager, Harold immediately agreed, as it aligned perfectly with his desires. The 5 managers chosen by the Holy Mother were unaware that a traitor had emerged among them. They gathered all the residents in the conference room to hold the first meeting since the establishment of the community. At first, the people were shouting, but everything changed when Larry appeared. He praised each resident for their contributions to the community, and with just a few words, he calmed everyone down. Stu, representing the management team, announced an important decision. Since the corpses had been properly handled, they would change the body disposal team into a patrol team for maintaining order. This would ensure safety within the residential area. Harold and Teddy donned patrol uniforms together, which, although they were all old gear from the ski club, they looked completely different when worn. Seeing Stu comforting and checking on each person made Harold extremely angry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flyer that warned against bringing flammable materials to the mountain. An idea struck him. He suddenly thought of a way to destroy the place. To ensure safety for mountain climbers, the ski club must have explosives to clear the snow. Harold and Larry planned to find this explosive stash to destroy the refugee camp, which seemed more satisfying than just killing a few managers. While the two snuck into the storage shed to take the explosives, Teddy happened to appear. Seeing Harold leave the shed, Teddy didn't suspect anything. Unexpectedly, Nadine shot Teddy dead. No matter how wicked Harold's nature was, he felt heartbroken over Teddy's untimely death. Nadine explained that she had done it out of necessity. If others found out about their plan to take the explosives, their scheme would fail. The next morning, everyone discovered Teddy's body in the square. After Harold received the news, he rushed to the scene, pretending to cry. He vowed to find the culprit who had killed his friend. The managers recalled Joe's warning and believed that Randall had begun to take action. It seemed the patrol team was too passive, so they had to think of a way to track down Randall. After some discussion, they decided to send 3 spies to infiltrate the enemy's ranks. Stu intended to go himself, but the others refused. The residential area needed a leader, and that he had already stepped forward in front of everyone. Franny suggested one of the spies should be Dana. She had previously killed a villain, making her the most suitable choice. The second candidate was Mrs. Judge, who too reclusively, but she had a calm and decisive demeanor. Everyone in the refuge had been personally chosen by the Holy Mother and regarded this place as home. Despite the difficult mission, the two agreed resolutely. When it came to the third candidate, everyone faced a dilemma. Nick pointed to a person. When the outbreak first occurred, he had encountered a man named Tom. Although Tom had intellectual disabilities, he was incredibly sincere and trustworthy, someone they could depend on. Moreover, Tom and Nick were among the first to arrive at the refugee camp, which made the Holy Mother feel at ease with them. However, Tom's intellect was limited, and he could only follow simple commands. Glenn helped Tom memorize lines to make it easier for him to blend in with the enemy ranks and wait for a favorable opportunity to escape. The 3 spies were chosen, and the manager quietly sent them off. Everyone was filled with anxiety. It would be an arduous journey. The 5 managers believed their plan was completely secret, but the Holy Mother immediately learned of it. She reprimanded Nick, believing that now was not the time to infiltrate the enemy's base, as it could provoke even more severe retaliation. The death of Teddy might have just been the beginning. The Holy Mother felt confused. As she calmly prayed, she suddenly heard the howling of wild wolves. A wolf appeared before her, while Harold, having just met Nadine, stepped outside and ran into Franny. To his surprise, Franny was unusually enthusiastic. She invited Harold to come to dinner, and he happily agreed, thinking that perhaps Franny had changed. Afterward, Franny went to find Larry. She asked for his help with something. That evening, she planned to distract Harold, and she asked Larry to search Harold's house. Growing up together in the town, Franny knew that Harold was a selfish and petty person. She suspected he might be involved in Teddy's death. Larry also felt that Harold's recent behavior was a bit unusual, so he agreed to help Franny. That night, Harold brought fresh flowers and wine to the dinner as promised, only to find that Stu was also present. They were somewhat dissatisfied, but still sat down to eat together. Franny quietly used the radio to notify Larry to begin the operation, and he immediately sneaked into Harold's house. The basement door was locked tight, so Larry didn't dare to make any rash moves, and instead searched around. Meanwhile, after drinking heavily, Harold used the excuse of needing to use the restroom to slip into Franny's bedroom. He looked at the teddy bear on the table and smirked. When he returned to the dining room, Harold claimed that he didn't handle alcohol well and needed to go home to rest. Meanwhile, Larry was still inside Harold's house and happened to find clothes that Nadine had worn. While Larry was in a daze, he received a message from Franny telling him that Harold had gone home. Larry was setting up the fallen chess pieces, preparing to leave when Harold reached the second floor. Harold noticed that his chess pieces had been changed and found Stu and Franny discussing their plan for the evening. Unbeknownst to them, Harold was watching them through a screen. He had installed a camera in Franny's house. Naturally, Larry's actions were also being recorded. At that moment, Stu received bad news. The Holy Mother had left the refuge camp, left only a message telling everyone not to look for her. Panic swept through the group as they wondered if the Holy Mother intended to abandon them or if she was on an important mission. Thankfully, they still had 3 insiders, and everyone believed they would soon receive intelligence from them. At the same time, Dana arrived at the headquarters of the villainous organization, only to discover that they had chosen Las Vegas as their new home. In this place, there were no laws or moral constraints, and all of the residents lived very freely. Dana quickly caught the attention of someone because of her beauty. That person was Lloyd, a criminal whom Randall had rescued from prison. As the free city became more prosperous, Lloyd's status rose accordingly. Dana began to accompany Lloyd to high-end venues, and eventually, they met Randall, who appeared like a god in that place. Dana unexpectedly spotted a familiar figure, the spy Tom. He arrived later than Dana, but relying on the lines he had memorized, he found a place to stay. However, the working environment was quite gruesome, as it involved disposing of bodies in the competition area. That evening, Dana used the excuse of having lost something to find Tom. While inquiring, she slipped him a note that simply read, "Run." Shortly after, Dana received a message from Lloyd, notifying her that Randall wanted to meet her. Dana was curious why a person of such high standing as Randall would pay attention to her. It turned out that he had already discovered Dana's identity as a spy and even knew her past. Randall could enter their dreams at will. Mrs. Judge had been uncovered a few days earlier, and after fleeing to the desert, she had gone missing. As long as Dana pointed out the third spy, Randall would let her go. Dana quickly realized that it might be due to Tom's intellectual disability that Randall couldn't enter his dreams. Knowing that escaping today would be difficult, Dana decided to sneak up and stab Randall in the neck. He collapsed to the ground, and she thought he might die so easily. To her surprise, he stood up as if nothing had happened. Since Dana refused to reveal anything, he resorted to coercion. Seeing this, Dana resolved to keep the secret at the cost of her life. What humanity excelled at, after all, was war. Even during the apocalypse, they still aspired to fight for survival. Meanwhile, the residents of the refuge camp were unaware that danger was approaching. They were worried about finding the Holy Mother, but after a day and night passed without any news, their concern grew. After all, an old woman over 100 years old could not survive alone in the woods. They were deeply anxious, not knowing why the Holy Mother had left. In reality, everything was part of Randall's scheme. He had long manipulated Nadine and Harold to cause an explosion in the refuge. He believed the Holy Mother could foresee the future and disrupt his plans. So, while she was praying, Randall transformed into a wolf and gave her fake guidance, leading her to follow the wolf away from the refuge, ultimately falling into Randall's trap. Only when she realized it was merely his illusion did the Holy Mother understand she had been deceived. She wanted to escape the dream and return to the refuge camp, but unexpectedly, Randall commanded the crows to push her down a cliff. This time, without the Holy Mother's guidance, Harold and Nadine could finally wreak havoc in the refuge camp. When they learned that the residents would gather at the Holy Mother's house to pray the next day, they felt secretly pleased. As the teacher of the refuge, Nadine had the freedom to enter the Holy Mother's quarters. She discreetly placed the disguised explosives in every corner of the house. Suddenly, Harold burst in, reminding Stu that he needed to continue searching for the Holy Mother. Seeing the affectionate way Stu looked at Franny filled Harold with anger. He glanced at the explosives in the corner. Franny keenly observed this and felt that something was off. She sneaked into Harold's house and pried open the basement door. As she descended, she saw the surveillance screens from her own home, leaving her confused. Looking around, she entered the workspace and found many sticks of dynamite on the table, along with detailed plans to destroy the refuge. Just then, the door opened and Harold returned. He scolded Franny for being there, claiming he was a person nobody paid attention to, who had waited for all the men in the town to die. Yet Franny still hadn't chosen him. He wanted to wipe out everyone there so that Franny would have no other choice. Franny couldn't believe her ears. She insisted that they were best friends who understood each other, but Harold was no longer the person he used to be. He had lost all reason, pushed Franny away, and locked the door. He told her he needed to accomplish something significant, and then she would surely admire him. Meanwhile, Larry was preparing to go out and participate in the prayer ceremony for the Holy Mother. While Nadine's gaze seemed somewhat evasive, she advised him that it was best to stay home and not go anywhere. But Larry, being the speaker, felt he could not miss the event. Nadine, no longer trying to dissuade him, went outside with the boy. Larry sensed that something was off with Nadine, so he went to inform Stu, only to find that the walkie-talkie had been sabotaged. He intended to ride to the prayer site, but his motorcycle was also broken. Meanwhile, Nadine had sent the boy to a preschool teacher for care, as he was too young to participate in the prayer ceremony. After everything was arranged, Nadine and Harold headed to their agreed-upon location. As soon as the prayer ceremony started, they immediately detonated it. However, they were unaware that Franny, locked in a room, had broken a window and escaped through a tunnel. The boy, watching television, seemed to hear a call and followed the sound into the woods, ultimately finding the Holy Mother lying on the ground. Not long after, Stu received a report from the patrol team that they had found the Holy Mother. He immediately canceled the prayer ceremony and informed everyone to go to the hospital. At that moment, Franny rushed in, urging Stu to warn everyone to flee. Meanwhile, Nick, preparing to head to the hospital, noticed that explosives had been placed everywhere. Just then, Nadine and Harold pressed the button and flames erupted into the dark sky. Seeing their plan succeed, Harold reminded Nadine that it was time to leave. At that moment, Randall seemed to sense something was amiss. He believed the explosion in the refuge camp was not going according to his plan, so he had to implement an alternative strategy. Randall ordered Lloyd to bring Mrs. Judge back, thinking he might extract intelligence from her. Within 2 days, the bounty hunters completed their mission, but they returned not with a living person but with the corpse of Judge. Randall was furious and coldly glared at the bounty hunters, reminding them they had 1 minute to leave. The bounty hunter realized he had no way to escape and turned to leave. However, even though the elevator doors had clearly closed, Randall appeared inside. As a horrifying scream echoed, the bounty hunter quickly grew some death in the elevator. This This was the first time Randall revealed his disgusting nature in front of the people, primarily because he was losing control, couldn't find the third spy. Living in fear, he was further unsettled by Mrs. Judge's death and decided to take action. Randall ordered his henchmen to capture all the new refugees. Unexpectedly, Tom had received a message from Dana a few days earlier. Despite his intellectual disabilities, Tom was very obedient. The next morning, he hid in a garbage truck to escape the hideous city. Not achieving the results he wanted, Randall sought a henchman in the dream world, a boy who had liked playing with fire since he was small and whose mind was not quite normal. Randall skillfully tempted the young man, telling him that the largest fire in the world was the nuclear warhead in a laboratory in the desert. Indeed, Randall planned to use nuclear weapons to obliterate the Holy Mother's refuge camp. Meanwhile, in the refuge, the manager had managed to extinguish the fire. Fortunately, the prayer ceremony had been cancelled in advance, so the casualties were not too severe. However, it was regrettable that Nick was near the explosives. During the burial, they couldn't find his body intact. At that moment, the Holy Mother woke up in her hospital bed. She instructed her assistant, Ray, to call the manager into her room. Everyone dared not delay. Even Franny, injured, arrived in a wheelchair. The Holy Mother's breath was very weak as she said that her mistakes could not be forgiven. The dark power was growing stronger, and it had to be stopped in time. She instructed everyone to set out on foot toward the west the following morning, warning that one among them was destined not to reach their destination. After saying this, she closed her eyes forever. Meanwhile, Nadine and Harold were riding their motorcycle toward the Free City. As they passed through the snowy mountains, Nadine suddenly accelerated. Harold, confused, chased after her to ask what was going on, but he didn't notice the curve ahead. Consequently, the motorcycle lost control and rolled down the cliff, with a branch piercing through him, leaving him unable to move. Harold hoped that Nadine would come back to save him, but she merely glanced back and then turned away. In that moment, he realized he had been used by Nadine. Before he died, he wrote down secrets related to the Free City, ultimately ending his life in despair and frustration. The managers began their journey toward the Free City, following the Holy Mother's instructions. Did not travel by any means. They had over 1,000 kilometers to cover, unsure of when they would arrive. That day, they passed the site of Harold's accident and saw his decayed corpse. Larry, unable to bear the sight, prepared to go down and help with the burial. He happened to find Harold's notebook, and at that moment, learned about Randall's ability to manipulate people. Harold had revealed that the more followers Randall had, the stronger he became. The managers grew increasingly fearful. After traveling a distance, they encountered an obstacle. A large crack separated them. It seemed they could only cross through the fissure. Stu descended first, and finding no issues, signaled for everyone to follow. However, while climbing back up, the ground gave way, causing Stu to fall. Although he was not in immediate danger, he broke his right leg. After the others helped him tend to his injury, continuing the journey seemed difficult. Stu remembered the prophecy of the Virgin Mary before she passed away, which foretold that one person would not be able to reach the destination. He urged everyone to continue their journey and not let his situation delay their plans. Silence fell among them in the desolate area, devoid of any signs of life. Stu knew he wouldn't be able to hold out. Glenn offered him a bag of painkillers, reminding Stu to take one every 12 hours. He then warned that taking 3 or 4 at once could be fatal. Glenn worried that Stu might face something even more terrifying than death while stuck there. After bidding farewell, the remaining 3 continued on their way. However, they hadn't gone far before a car stopped before them. It turned out to be Lloyd in the Free City, and unexpectedly, Randall had anticipated this. They had fallen into a trap. Meanwhile, the young man whom Randall had seduced found a nuclear warhead. He was extremely excited and wanted to return quickly to prove himself. The radiation indexes peaked, indicating its devastating power. The strength of the opposing faction had grown tremendously. They wielded nuclear weapons and could foresee the future. Meanwhile, the forces of justice were at a disadvantage, especially since the Holy Mother had died. With their small human strength, they were left wondering what to do. Survivors in the apocalypse were struck by lightning, and the only lavish city also fell into a moment of destruction. Time returned to the night 2 days earlier. Larry, Glenn, and Ray were taken to the Free City, where they curiously admired the lavish roads. By chance, they discovered that every so often they found fleeing criminals who had been brutally tortured. Soon after, they arrived at the Supreme Management headquarters, where they were greeted by their old friend Nadine. To their surprise, she looked extremely weak and was pregnant after just a few days apart. The outcome for the 3 of them wasn't much better. They were locked in a cage. The ruler, Randall, wanting to showcase the superiority of his regime, held a public trial for the 3 refugees from the refugee camp. Lloyd arrogantly stated that if they admitted to coming from the wasteland and agreed to join the Free City, they would be released. Glenn immediately objected, pointing out that even though they had just arrived, the scenes they witnessed on the way showed that the people there lived in fear. Glenn then addressed the camera, demanding that Randall come to confront them in person. Lloyd immediately knocked Glenn to the ground. Glenn stood up and said surely. Lloyd submitted to Randall out of fear. Enraged that Glenn had spoken the truth, Lloyd ruthlessly shot him dead. Such a brutal scene left the citizens in shock, and many began to reconsider Glenn's words. Randall, observing from a distance, suddenly felt his power waning. Harold had once mentioned that Randall's strength came from the people's worship, and now, with his reputation affected, his power would gradually weaken. They had discussed their plans, and it seemed that Glenn's death was not in vain. Meanwhile, Stu, forced to stay behind due to his broken leg, thought he would surely die there. Unexpectedly, Glenn's dog had separated from the group and returned to protect Stu during the freezing night. When Stu felt the the most desperate. The dog acted as a loyal guardian, chasing away any wild animals that came near, allowing Stu to survive. Meanwhile, Larry and Ray were still discussing their plans when Nadine suddenly brought someone in, taking Ray with her and leaving Larry in the room. Then Nadine asked the most important question. She asked how the boy was doing. Larry told her to focus on herself first, noting how much her appearance had deteriorated in just a few days. Nadine didn't understand what Larry was talking about, insisting that she was doing well. After arriving in the Free City, Randall immediately made her his queen, and she felt very happy. Larry then held up an inox tray for Nadine to see her reflection. The moment she looked, her expression changed dramatically. Previously, she had appeared beautiful and alluring in the bedroom and the elevator, but now she wondered if everything she had seen was a lie. Suddenly, Nadine felt intense pain in her abdomen. She was giving birth much sooner than expected. Even as she reached the delivery room, she struggled to run and ask Randall what she was pregnant with, feeling as though she was about to die. Randall told her that it was the Prince of the Free City and that her mission was to give birth to him. Nadine finally came to a realization. The message Randall had left decades earlier, claiming she was his queen, was nothing but a lie. She was merely a breeding tool for him. After grasping the truth, Nadine used a gem from her necklace to smash the glass window and decisively jumped down. Randall screamed, shocked that the prince he had longed for had died before even being born. Lloyd felt the wrath of Randall, sensing that his soul was trembling, so he proactively approached and flattered him, claiming that he was the first follower Randall had accepted. Although Randall appeared calm, he issued a brutal order, commanding Lloyd to bring Nadine's head to Larry. Randall believed that these two were responsible for Nadine's death and decided they must pay the price. After making his statement, Randall received cheers from the crowd, restoring his reputation. He declared that he would use nuclear weapons to obliterate the refuge camp. The screen displayed the streets of the Free City, where the young man had returned with the nuclear warhead. As the water level rose, the cheers grew louder. To please Randall, Lloyd prepared to mock Larry. Larry, however, stated that he feared no evil forces. Feeling mocked, Lloyd struck Larry with a stick, but this did not deter Larry. Eventually, someone in the crowd could no longer hold back and shouted that they were not afraid of evil forces. Randall quickly found the speaker and ordered his henchmen to kill him. Then another person stood up, also declaring they were not afraid of evil. The situation spiraled out of control. At that moment, the young man brought the nuclear warhead into the hall. He had been ravaged by radiation, barely resembling a human, yet he persisted in completing his mission. But in the eyes of the people, Randall disregarded the lives of others and thought about past events. The people's worship turned into resentment, leading to Randall's punishment. Suddenly, thunder and dark clouds enveloped the building, causing everyone to look up in alarm. Lightning struck, and the terrified crowd began to flee. Finding the doors locked, they charged against them with all their strength. Lightning repeatedly struck Randall's henchmen. Lloyd thought he could escape, but was struck by a falling chandelier. Randall looked up as the lightning converged into a ball of electricity, and he seemed to see the Holy Mother. He was struck by lightning and disintegrated into smoke. Yet it did not end there. The lightning continued to strike the nuclear warhead, and under the heat, it immediately exploded. A mushroom-shaped cloud rose above the city, and Stu in a trance was awakened by the light. Then an earthquake struck. Amid the rubble, a figure approached. It was Tom. To their surprise, the only city left in the apocalypse had been destroyed like this, leaving only the refugee settlement. Weeks later, Franny gave birth successfully, but unfortunately, shortly after, the baby's neck became swollen. The infant had fallen ill, causing Franny great distress as she feared the baby would die. Unexpectedly, a few days later, the baby was completely healthy. This was the first case of a human born with antibodies against the disease, suggesting that humanity still had hope. What surprised Franny even more was that Stu had returned safely. Sadly, the other managers had perished. Perhaps the Holy Mother had foreseen everything and had them walk to the Free City so that Stu could escape safely. The residential area continued to develop under their management. Franny thought long and hard before deciding to venture outside. Stu, of course, did not want her to risk going alone, so the family of three, along with their dog, left the residential area. They passed through many states but did not encounter any survivors until they reached a farm in the suburbs. The dog seemed to detect something in the cornfield, and soon after, an arm reached out to grab a doll on the ground. When night fell, a little girl looked up at the sky, mumbling something. The next morning, Franny discovered that the baby was sick. Stu immediately drove to the supermarket to find some medicine. While Franny was home alone fetching water, she accidentally fell into a deep well. In her dazed state, she found herself in a forest where she saw Randall. He told her that he wanted to show her something. Unexpectedly, deep in the forest, there was a primitive tribe was living that had never been attacked by the disease. After saying this, Randall waved his hand, showing Franny the moment she fell down the well. She had suffered severe fractures and was holding a piece of bone that pierced her lung, while her child cried from hunger. Stu's car had broken down on the way, preventing him from returning in time. Franny fell into despair, believing that she had to submit to Randall to have any chance of survival. Fortunately, Franny had a strong will and did not fall for his temptations. Just as she was about to escape the forest, she suddenly appeared in a cornfield. The familiar sound of singing led her to a house, and upon approaching, she saw the Holy Mother. Her expression remained gentle as she comforted Franny, telling her not to worry too much. Franny would become the mother of 5 children, who would grow up to have 20 more, creating a large family of 70. By then, the earth would become bustle again. Meanwhile, in reality, Stu had finished fixing the car and hurried back to the farm, where a little girl was taking care of the baby. The girl informed him that Franny was down the well. Hearing this, Stu was horrified and quickly lowered a rope to rescue her. Then, a miraculous scene occurred. The girl lightly touched Franny, and her wounds instantly healed. Franny stood up as if nothing had happened, while the girl vanished as if she had never been there. Stu believed that the girl was the Holy Mother. After this experience, Franny began to believe in the spiritual power of the world. She said that everything had both good and evil sides, with one side representing the deep darkness like the well itself. However, as long as one's will was strong enough, it was possible to reach the place where the light shone. It seemed that her mission still had to continue. Just as Franny had dreamed, deep in the forest, the Dark Lord Randall had returned to life. Above was the complete content of the film The Stand. Thank you all for watching and following along. Goodbye, and see you next time.